So I think we'll go ahead and begin this seminar. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Cam Carter, together with Lee Tien. We are the co-directors of the UC Davis Cannabis and Hemp Research Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's Cannabis and Hemp Research Forum. It is hosted by the UC Davis Cannabis and Hemp Research Center, and this is the first forum of the new academic year. So I want to welcome you all. The purpose of this monthly forum is to inform our campus community members, members of the cannabis and hemp industry, and the general public about research on cannabis and hemp that's being conducted at UC Davis, and also to provide an opportunity for guest researchers, such as our speaker today, to share their expertise. As today's presentation is underway, you'll be able to pose written questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. Our presenter will save time at the end to address your questions. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be made available in the next few days on the Cannabis and Hemp Research Center website at cannabis.ucdavis.edu under the Education tab. And now for today's research forum. We welcome Tom Marquette from UC San Diego. So Dr. Marquette is a professor of psychiatry at UCSD, and he's the co-director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, which has been conducting clinical trials and other research into cannabis for almost 20 years, and has a very, Dr. Marquette has a very active ongoing portfolio exploring the effects of cannabinoids in various medical and psychiatric conditions, and is currently the principal investigator on studies addressing cannabis effects on important behaviors such as driving. We are very excited to have Tom give this talk today, and I'm going to turn the forum over to him.
Well, thanks, Cam, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Let me pull this up. And are you seeing my title slide? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Okay, okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to talk about the challenge of cannabis and driving. I'm just going to provide a very brief background on previous research, and then we'll talk a lot about the study we just completed. So what we know from many studies is that when people get acutely high, they have certain cognitive changes, including reduced learning, attention, declines in processing speed, and in psychomotor abilities. When we look at performance on either controlled on-road studies or more frequently simulator studies, we see certain patterns of behavior such as delayed reaction time, so greater time before someone brakes, poor lane tracking or following or in essence, swerving across a lane. We call that standard deviation of lateral position. Reduced judgment of speed and distances, and these are often dose dependent. The higher the THC, the worse someone does. Given all that though, the epidemiological studies are actually kind of mixed. We see a modest increased crash risk out in the real world, and the state experience is still evolving, which I'll address in just a minute. We know that the impact of cannabis is amplified by co-use of alcohol. It's really not clear yet whether that's just an additive effect or it's synergistic in the case of 1 + 1 = 2 or 1 + 1 = 3 when you combine the two of those together. We know that at least so far, there's evidence that CBD is not impairing. Some people may get a little drowsy depending on the dose. The research to date also indicates that CBD doesn't mitigate the effects of THC. It perhaps reduces some of the anxiety, et cetera, but it's not clear. There's no clear evidence that it reduces the cognitive impacts, but there's still much research to be done in that area. And then unlike alcohol, at the group level, cannabis users tend to judge themselves to be more impaired, so they're more cautious. They allow more headway with cars in front of them. They drive more slowly. They avoid passing other vehicles. Now, again, this is at the group level. Individual drivers can show poor judgment, can have different types of impairments. But in general, people under the influence of alcohol are just much more risk-taking across the board. In terms of the state experience, this is just an example, if you were kind of monitoring this, what you have seen over the last few years. So back in 2017, a report came out saying that marijuana-related traffic deaths more than doubled from 2013 to 2016. However, a publication in an academic journal at the same time said that actually there were no statistically significant differences between states with and without legalization. A report out of Nevada indicated that there actually been a drop in traffic deaths with the legalization of recreational marijuana. And then more recently, a study came out indicating that it's actually mixed depending on what state you're in. So why are we seeing this disconnect between what we see in driving simulators and out in the real world? First of all, the impact of legalization may vary regionally. So that last study I just cited found that Colorado had a greater increase in crashes, and they attributed that to things such as cannabis tourism, right? Washington has legalization, but also already had access through Canada and other locations. The number of dispensaries and the density of dispensaries and so forth. So it really is kind of regionally specific. When we look at these epidemiologic or real world studies, we also have to keep in context the regional and national trends. So you can't simply look at one state and say, oh my gosh, crashes have gone up, when in fact, perhaps nationally they've been going up, which actually has been the case in the last couple of years. So you really need to look at what's the comparison group being used for each individual state. Out in the real world, cannabis-related crashes may also relate to concurrent use of other substances. It's actually fairly infrequent to see cannabis only in crashes. Quite often, it's co-use of alcohol, most commonly, but other drugs as well. It is also possible that people under the influence of cannabis use compensatory behavior. So they sense that they're impaired, they drive slower, they drive more cautious, as I noted earlier. So in our studies, we asked them to do certain tasks in driving simulators. Perhaps they wouldn't do those tasks out in the real world. They would be more cautious. The doses in these controlled studies often don't reflect what the THC exposure is in experienced users. And then it's also possible the magnitude of effect that we've seen in previous studies just is not large enough to actually affect real world performance. So with that background, the aims of the current study I'm going to talk about were to determine, with respect to driving impairment, what's the magnitude and the time course of effects of THC exposure? What's the impact of cannabis with different THC contents or amounts in a cigarette? Are there tolerance effects? And what's the accuracy of self-perception of impairment versus actual performance? This was a quite large study. We recruited 191 regular cannabis users. And for this study, we chose a parallel design. So all studies previously have been crossover designs where an individual is exposed to cannabis, a placebo, and they cross over multiple times. The reason we chose a parallel design was multifold. One was it would help maintain the blind. So previous studies, including studies here at the CMCR, have shown that if individuals get placebo first, they may be fooled or confused whether or not they're getting THC. But as soon as they cross over, they know when they're getting the active drug. We were also interested in generalizability. We wanted a large representation for these studies. Most previous studies have used about 20 to 40 individuals. And then we were also concerned with attrition. As you'll see, this study was very intensive. And the more times you call someone back, the more likely they are to drop out. In addition, going back to generalizability, if you demand or expect someone to come in multiple days over the course of the study, you're shrinking your pool to people who are available Monday through Friday to take off many days to do a study such as this. So in this case, we expected one experimental day. So we brought in these 191 individuals. We randomized them to get either placebo, 0% THC, 5.9% THC, or 13.4% THC. This is from the NIDA drug supply program and from the University of Mississippi. Now, this was the highest THC level available at the time that we started the study a few years ago. Clearly, it's higher in dispensaries. NIDA is actually getting better at getting up to 18, 20% THC. So it's evolving, but this is what was available at the time of the study. And then we bring individuals and we assess them throughout the course of the day on driving simulations. We do blood draws and so forth. Now, a key component of the study is to realize we did ad libitum smoking. We told them to smoke the joint or cigarette the way you do at home to get high, so they could choose their own level of highness. Our concern was that we would do this large study. If we gave them prescribed dosing and showed impairment, people could come back and say, I would never get that high. I would never get that high and drive. So we wanted to have a real world representativeness and have people smoke as they normally do. Here's just a few examples of the types of simulations. There's a 25-minute simulation each time. We went through different types of environments, both residential and business. We had people merge on and off of freeways. We had a distracted driving task I'll show you in a minute, in which we wanted people to take their eyes off the road, as many of us often, unfortunately do, and see how that affected performance. We had them make left-hand turns across oncoming traffic. In the yellow light dilemma, they need to decide if it's safe to go through a yellow light or not. We had a few crash avoidance situations, but only about one per simulation. I wanted to be real world. I did not want people to be concerned that some object could jump in front of them any minute. So they would be hyper vigilant during the entire task. We wanted to be pretty much a normal, boring drive that might have something occasionally surprise you. This is the distracted driving task. So they'd be driving down the road, the phone would ring, they need to look over to the iPad on the side, to the side of the monitor and identify the circle that's a different size than the other circle. So there were easier ones where it was much larger than the other circles, and others where it was much closer in size. So while they're doing this, we look at how much they swerve, how much they maintain their lane position, and how accurate they are on this task. We could have used things such as phones, GPS, etc., but this we felt was a nice mix of good experimental control with some face validity to it. The other structured task that we had during the simulation was car following. In this task, a car shows up in front of you, it speeds up and slows down very subtly, and we look at how well you maintain your distance and correlate with the performance of that car in front of you. This is what the day looked like. As you can see, we kept people very busy. So they would come in. So prior to the study, we'd bring them in for an hour and they would do nothing but training on the simulator. We really wanted it to feel like a natural process, like it was real driving. So they'd be trained on the simulator. Then on the experimental day, they come in, they drive, they get some fluid draws, etc. Then they smoke over the course of 10 minutes. And then over the course of the next 5 hours or so, we do multiple blood draws. We had 8 additional blood draws. We look at oral fluid breath. At the top, you can see the driving simulation times. Roughly, it was 30 minutes, 90 minutes, 3.5 and 4.5 hours. And then we also did field sobriety tests that I'm not going to talk about today. This is what the cohort looked like. Average age of 30. As you can see, we had fairly good representation, 60% male, 40% female. And by design, we were looking for a broad range of cannabis use. And we split the group as we recruited them into those who smoked less than 4 times a week and those who smoked 4 times or more a week. As you can see, the recruitment worked out perfectly. I will tell you, this was the easiest study we've ever had to recruit for. Paying people fairly good money to get high seems to be a good selling item. So it was an easy study to enroll. In general, people smoked about 18 days in the last 30 days. And when they smoked about 0.5 grams, in essence, kind of a small cigarette or joint when they smoked. Again, that's on average. We had a range. I mentioned earlier the issue of blinding. This is the subject's guess as to what they thought they received. As you can see in the placebo group, it worked out quite well. Half of them thought they got the real thing. They may have not thought it was a great cannabis, but they thought they got active THC. In the THC group, you can see almost all of them knew that they got the active product. So this is one of the main findings when we look at the simulator. On the bottom, obviously, is the placebo and THC groups. On the y-axis is the change in the composite drive score. So based on sort of key variables, what we felt were the most sensitive variables from that driving simulator, we combined them into a single score called the composite drive score, which gives us sort of an overall feel of how well they did. We also looked at all the individual components, but we really wanted an omnibus measure of driving performance. And this is the change in that score. So we looked at the change from before smoking and after smoking at different time points. This is the first time point about 30 minutes after they smoke. A higher score indicates that they were doing worse. A lower score shows improvements. And as you can see here, in the THC group, there was a substantial portion of people who did worse after smoking, a P of 0.0003. But what we also saw was there was a significant amount of overlap, such that a number of people, a significant proportion of the people in the THC group did no worse than individuals in the placebo group after smoking. Now, it's very hard to determine whether someone is impaired on an experimental measure. You have to use statistical approaches. In this case, we looked at the distribution of change in the placebo group and estimated that about 45% of the people in the THC group would be called impaired on the simulator. So not everyone, but about half. As I mentioned earlier, we were also interested in the effect of THC content. So there's a lot of concern that as THC levels increase in the available products, that people will be becoming increasingly impaired and really, really impaired. This looks at the likely exposure that the participants had to THC based on the amount of the joint they smoked and the THC content of that joint. So as you can see, the group in the 13.4% group was likely to have much greater exposure to THC. What happened was that the participants in both groups smoked about the same amount of the joint, so about 60 to 70% of the cigarette. And given that amount of weight that's left over, we expect about twice the amount of exposure to THC. But here's what we found. So this is looking at driving performance on the y-axis. In this case, again, higher is worse performance compared to baseline. These are the time points, 30, hour and a half, 3.5 hours that we followed them. And this is a change score, so it doesn't start out at 0. So a couple things to look at here. One is the placebo group is in yellow. And as you can see, they were fairly stable over the course of the day. This was actually quite a relief because we really wanted it to be real world like. And in the real world, we don't get better and better during the course of the day as we're driving an automobile. So it looks like they actually acclimated quite well to the simulator, and it didn't seem like a novel experience that they kept learning on. When we look up at the THC groups, we see the 5.9% in green and the 13.4% in blue. And it is quite striking that regardless of the THC content level of the cigarette, they found the same level of worse performance or impairment on the driving simulator. So even though in the previous slide, I showed that the 13.4% had potentially twice the amount of THC exposure, in fact, when it came to performance, they performed the exact same in essence. Now, we attribute this to self-titration, right? So when you inhale, you can decide how much you want to inhale, how long to hold it in, how deep side stream smoke can come out. And so they found, when we look at level of highness, about the same level of highness in both groups. And we look at blood THC concentrations after smoking, the 5.9% actually had slightly higher, but in essence, they found very similar levels of THC concentrations after smoking. So self-titrating sort of equalized everything, which gives some solace that at least in terms of smoking plant material, the higher it goes, people may smoke it so that they get no more impaired. The other interesting side comment is if people are paying a lot of extra money to get a higher THC content plant material, they may be wasting their time because they may smoke in a way that gets them no higher than if they were smoking a lower content. The other thing to look at here is the time course of impairment or performance. And as you can see, at 30 minutes, there was a significant difference between the placebo and the THC groups. At an hour and a half, that maintained. They did not show improvement. Then by about 3.5 hours, it was no longer statistically significant, though there was a trend for differences. And then at the end of 4.5 hours, they were back to baseline and basically could not be differentiated between the three groups. So as you know, we have p-values, which show statistical significance, but we also want to know what's the magnitude of the effect or the effect size. And as we see here at 30 minutes and an hour and a half, it was in the medium range. So it's not huge, but it's also, probably an important, clinically important level of differences and magnitude of effect between the groups. By 3.5 hours, that was dropping down to the small range, and then there was no effect at all at 4.5 hours. Another area of interest was what's the accuracy of perception of safety compared to how people actually perform on the simulator. So at the bottom, we see the time course. On the right-hand side, we ask them, how impaired are you to drive? This is in the THC group. And as you can see, at 30 minutes, people felt fairly impaired. At an hour and a half, it was improving. At 3.5 hours, it still improved, and then it was very low at 4.5 hours. We also asked them, well, you may feel a little impaired to drive, but would you drive in your current state? These are the percentage of people who would not drive in their current state. So as you can see, at 30 minutes, about half the people who received active THC said they would not drive at that time. At an hour and a half, that dropped down to 30% and so forth. Now, if you recall, going back 2 slides, when we look at the simulator performance here on the left y-axis, remember they did worse at 30 minutes. They were still doing poorly at an hour and a half. At least on the simulator, we only saw improvement happening as they got out to the 3.5 hour time point, and then much better at 4.5 hours. So a particularly concerning time point is this hour and a half point, right? We have even people who are very conscientious and they're saying, I'm too stoned, I'm not going to drive right after they smoke. An hour and a half later, may be feeling it's wearing off, that I'm doing better, I'm okay to go on the road. In fact, what we see in terms of objective performance is that not much has changed. They are still driving just as poorly. And in fact, they should wait longer before they go driving. This perhaps bears out in this graph. So as you recall, as they're driving down the road, the phone rings, they need to turn to the right-hand side and tap on the iPad to identify the circle that is different than the others. There's a tendency when people do that they tend to swerve towards the right. Right, they're turning that way. And what we looked at here was how much time did they spend over the shoulder of the road. So they may not have crashed. So it wasn't a dramatic, lack of attention where they actually went completely off the road, but they were swerving onto the shoulder of the road. In yellow is the placebo group. In green is the THC group. As you see in the pre-smoke conditions, the two groups were very similar. In terms of time over the shoulder line. At 30 minutes, they actually were not statistically different in terms of how much time was over the line. But where we see the greatest difference is at an hour and a half, and then they do better later on. So it could at least be hypothesized that this is a time point, again, where people are feeling it's wearing off, they're becoming less vigilant and less attentive, and they're more likely to make these types of errors that are dangerous. Maybe not so bad that they crash, but enough that they're starting to not pay attention and do some dangerous maneuvers. We also asked them, how much did the study drug affect your driving? As you can see here, the THC group at every single time point felt that the cannabis was affecting their driving performance. In that same questionnaire, we asked them, how well did you drive? As you can see here, at 30 minutes, the THC group thought they drove worse than the placebo group. Now, obviously, they're just reporting on their own determination of driving performance. They don't know how the placebo group is doing. So they're aware at 30 minutes, but then at an hour and a half and so forth, there is no difference between the two groups. The THC group reports driving just as well as the placebo group. So even though on the bottom of this graph, they said, yes, I'm high, a little stoned, it's probably affecting my driving, I still think I did just fine. And again, we know at least from the objective measures, that's not the case. Now, if they were doing so poorly that they were crashing a lot, they might be aware of that. In this case, we're not looking at crashes. There actually were no significant difference in crash rates on the simulator, but on all these other variables indicating reduction in driving, the THC group was doing worse at 90 minutes. Another area of interest for us was tolerance, right? We know that there's a lot of reports that if you're a regular user, sort of acclimate to cannabis and you don't get stoned using the same amount of THC as someone who's less experienced. And the way I chose to examine this was to look at use history in the last 6 months. So this is all self-report, so it certainly has some error involved. But we looked at how often they said they had used cannabis in the last 6 months, and when they used, how much did they use? So this is looking across, in this case again, all the people who were assigned to active THC. So that's about 128 people. We looked at their use history and created a distribution based upon the total exposure that they were like to have had to THC. And based on the distribution, I divided it into 3 groups. One was the lowest quartile, the lowest 25% in terms of exposure to THC in the last 6 months. The highest quartile, and then in between the 25th to 75th percentile. So we're kind of looking at the extremes of the low, the extremes of the high, and then sort of the middle average group. And that's what we see across the x-axis here are those 3 groups. We then looked at the blood THC concentration right after smoking, which is on the y-axis. And as you can see here, the group with the highest use intensity over the last 6 months achieved significantly higher THC concentrations in their blood after smoking. Those who were less experienced and less frequent users and had less use intensity had the lowest level of THC concentration. So it's sort of the stair-step effect we might expect. We then looked at those same 3 groups, low, middle, and high, and looked at their driving performance. This again is the change in this drive score, this composite drive score, higher is worse. And as you can see, despite the group with the highest level of use intensity over the last 6 months, having significantly higher THC concentrations, they did no worse than anyone with lower THC concentrations in the other groups. So this suggests that yes, indeed, there is behavioral tolerance, that the more people use, the more they can ingest or consume, and they don't become more impaired based upon the development of behavioral tolerance. But the other take-home message from this is that they compensated for that behavioral tolerance by ingesting more. So while they did no worse on the driving simulator, they also did no better. So when we tell people to smoke ad lib, go to the level of highness you desire, the people who had developed behavioral tolerance consumed more THC and ended up at about the same place as people who had less experience. Obviously, as you know, there has been, at least historically, a strong interest in, boy, can we use per se laws? Can't we just identify a blood level that is associated with impaired driving? A few states, Colorado, Washington, a few others have actually, in Canada as well, have established some per se laws suggesting that if you have 5 nanograms or more in your blood, you're sort of by default considered driving under the influence. So the notion here is we'd like something like alcohol, where 0.08 means regardless of any testing, et cetera, you're considered driving under the influence. This is what we see when we look at the blood THC level on the x-axis right after smoking, and the change in the drive score on the y-axis. And as you can see, there is a striking lack of any relationship between THC blood concentrations and driving performance. So what happens, THC, I'll show you in a minute, distributes very quickly to the brain, to other fatty tissues, and there may be other factors involved, from tolerance to genetics, et cetera. We don't know. But the reality is, when we try to get people at their highest level of THC, we see no relationship between driving performance and THC concentrations. This has been shown in other smaller studies, and this sort of drives home that the notion of trying to identify a per se level for THC is just not feasible. This is perhaps my favorite graph, which explains some of this. And this is from Marilyn Hustis from many years ago. This is called counterclockwise hysteresis. And this looks at the relationship between blood THC concentrations and feeling high. So on the x-axis, we see the THC concentration in blood. On the y-axis, this is the change in feeling high. So higher means you're feeling more stoned. And then this goes in a counterclockwise fashion. So here you can see after a person smokes, 1.8 minutes, 4.5 minutes, 6 minutes, then to 45 minutes, and all the way to 12 hours. What this shows is right after you smoke, THC levels go very high. So when you look at concentrations here, we see them going up to almost 140 across the x-axis. So at about 1.8 minutes, at about 6 to 10 minutes, we're getting the peak THC concentrations. And this actually relates well to level of highness. So as people are starting to feel that THC get into their blood, they're feeling higher. So by about 10 minutes, there's this nice relationship between feeling high and the level of THC in your system. However, very quickly, THC disperses and it leaves the blood, right? It likes fat. And so it starts going to the brain, starts going to other locations. And you can see here that over the course of the next 45 minutes, THC is dropping like a rock, right? So by 45 minutes to an hour, we're down to about 10 nanograms. However, during that same period that THC is dropping out of the blood, people are still feeling high. Then after about an hour and a half, they start feeling the highness wear off, and it starts dropping. And we see a little bit of movement in THC concentrations at that time, but not much because they're already pretty low. So the challenge here is that a person can have very high THC levels and concentrations and feel high, but they can also have low THC concentrations and be high. And they can also have low THC concentrations and not be stoned. So this kind of drives home that it is really hard to relate THC concentrations in blood to behavioral manifestations. So in summary, cannabis can clearly impair driving. It has a range of impact, though. Not all users become significantly impaired following acute use. The effects we see are most pronounced during the first 2 hours. We see some recovery at approximately 3.5 to 4.5 hours. Again, keep in mind, this is smoking one cigarette, so it's not cumulative use. And people had abstained 48 hours before starting the study. So again, it's a controlled laboratory setting. We see no relationship between blood THC concentrations and driving performance. Users perceive that the effects begin resolving before performance improves, which is an important public safety messaging item to get out there. And experienced users develop behavioral tolerance, but may counteract this by consuming more THC. So most of these findings have been published recently, earlier in the year, in JAMA Psychiatry. We made sure it's an open access publication, so you can go there and download it for free. if you're interested in hearing more, either from me or Dr. Fitzgerald, who did the toxicology for the study, we did an author podcast with JAMA, and that's also available on the website. A study such as this takes a lot of individuals to make it successful. So this is the cast of characters who were involved in doing the study. Again, this was recruiting 200 people and testing them during the course of a full day. Dr. Hustis was a consultant, and we very much want to thank the state of California, in particular Assemblyman Lackey had the forethought to realize that legalization is here and we need to know more about the effect of cannabis on driving. So they provided funding to do this study. And then we carried it out here at the CMCR, which also provided resources for the project. Here's my email address at the bottom. If anyone wants to follow up with me on any items, I'm happy to do so. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. So just for our audience, the Q&A is open for your questions. I'll start with a sort of general question, if I could. So first, Tom, I want to acknowledge how much work this must have been, both, you know, the initial navigation of the regulatory environment, and then, you know, what is a really large and very well controlled study. And I think the results are also incredibly clear and informative. And I guess what I'm wondering is, again, given the sort of unequivocal nature of many of the effects that you showed in the relationship between, you know, individual differences and dosage and impairment, what should we do with this? How can this make an impact, you know, on our public health policy, and you know, how can we help people be safe in a nation that is probably going to be completely recreational, you know, very soon?
Yeah, so a great question. So there are many different levels of possible involvement. One, first of all, we want to keep the people who are impaired off the road. So, you know, anything we can do in terms of public messaging. I know Colorado's been trying for a number of years and learned along the way as to what communication methods work best with users. I was at a presentation where they were talking about previous videos that I had seen that they showed on websites showing kind of humorous situations where people were having TVs fall off the wall and doing dumb things while they were stoned. And it got a lot of hits on a website, and they were really well done. They were entertaining. And then they found out, I believe, that they had very little impact because most people who saw them thought they were funny, but said, that's not me. So as much as, you know, it was sort of the classic stoner, and I think they've shifted their messaging. In the case of our study, I think really getting out there that people need to realize they're not always the best judge of whether or not they're impaired. And understanding this time course that's just psychologically, for whatever reasons, there's this tendency, and it's the same with alcohol, that people feel it's wearing off before it's actually wearing off. So I think that's an important message to get out there to get people from going on the road. The other message here is that, you know, the reality is not everyone does really poorly right after they smoke or after they use. You know, it's very understandable to want to be very cautious and tell people not to drive, but people still do it anyway. So the question is, how can we, you know, do our best, perhaps working with law enforcement, to really sort of maximize our ability to differentiate between people who are impaired due to cannabis or not impaired. And this is particularly driven home by people who are medicinal users who may use regularly. They may have THC in their system, but unlike this one where we show behavioral tolerance is offset by people using more, people who use it medicinally may use a standard dose along the way, and this behavioral tolerance may mean they are less impaired when they go on the road. So on the kind of enforcement side, I think continuing to work on methods for identifying people impaired due to cannabis is important, because being exposed to cannabis clearly is not enough, or at least in our study. And it's true for other studies. Let me just say that I think we made a point about the overlap in terms of performance. And when you look at studies, many have that. One of the flaws in how we think, even as scientists, is that we see there's an effect size and we think it's true for everybody. We always forget there's this overlap that some people weren't so badly affected. And so how do we go about differentiating between those two?
Great, thank you. We do have a question from Dan Parfit. And basically, I think a very interesting question. How does the magnitude and the nature of the effects that you saw in this study with cannabis compare to those that you would see with alcohol?
So it's a great question. It's everyone's favorite question, and I unfortunately end up with a long response, which is it's complicated. So, when people look at alcohol, so everyone's favorite variable, mine as well, is this STLP, or standard deviation of lateral position. How much do you swerve under the influence? Most all studies use that as an outcome because it's very sensitive, it's continuous, it's easy to work with. And so when people do cannabis and alcohol studies, they look at swerving. Even on-road studies, they compare how people do under the influence of cannabis to alcohol. And in general, when people get stoned, they come out with roughly an equivalent of a BAC of 0.05. My argument would be interesting, we'll do the same thing, but I'm not sure the risks are the same. As I commented, people under the influence of cannabis tend to be more aware that they're impaired. Even if they're not accurate, they tend to be more cautious. People under the influence of alcohol tend to be much more risk-taking and have many other factors that I think would put people at a risk for a crash than necessarily under cannabis. So while swerving may correlate with performance or with exposure to these different substances, the other risk factors that may put a person at risk for a crash, I think, are substantially different. Alcohol is just not a good drug. It's not something to be under the influence and go driving, because people tend to be actually kind of stupid when they start driving under the influence. But if we just look at STLP, it's about a 0.05 BAC level.
Okay, great, thank you. We do have another question. This is from Tahadiro Godfa. People still keep the high feeling after THC levels in the blood decreased a lot. Does it suggest that particular neuronal circuits in the brain keep being activated for a long time by the initial THC receptor signal?
That would be my assumption. Yes, we're still dying to do. I think Relin and Hustis has collaborated with some people looking at CB1 receptors, and there's still a lot of sort of in vivo work we want to do with imaging to better understand what's going on with THC in the brain. And I think we're going to get there, but right now we don't have much looking at acute administration and what's going on with brain function.
Great. So I'll give maybe another 30 seconds for people to type their question in the chat. And while we're waiting, I'll just thank the audience and especially Dr. Marcotte for giving us his time today. This talk will be on the web within the next few days, and we'll be linking it to the UC San Diego website. So if you want to go visit the UC San Diego website, you can find this talk there as well. Our next speaker is going to be Keith Allen. He's the Director of Bioinformatics at Front Range Biosciences. And the working title of that talk is Structure, Function, and Evolution of the Cannabinoid Synthase Family in Cannabis. So please join us again next month. And once again, our thanks to Tom for this really, really interesting, stimulating, and very relevant talk.
Thank you. I was happy to join. Bye, Ken.
Thank you.